Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Robert Hurlbut. Robert, thanks for being here.
Hey, Chris. Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited to chat with you all things threat modeling. But for folks that don't know you, maybe haven't seen some of your work or heard you speak at other industry events, can you tell us a bit about your background first?
Sure. Yeah, Robert Hurlbut. I have been a longtime software developer, software architect, and then security architect, application security architect for many, many years. And so I've built a lot of systems over the years for different companies. I was an independent consultant for many years and working with both commercial and some government work and lots and lots of different industries. Probably about 17 years ago or so, I started getting more and more interested in application security and in particular threat modeling. There was a book that came out and I from Microsoft. I got a hold of it. I looked at it, said, "This is fantastic. Why haven't we been doing this already?" And I just started applying it to my own work and talking about it. And then over time, in the last 7, 8 years, I just switched completely to threat modeling and working with teams and helping them think about secure design and so on. Today, or last number of years, I've also been a part of a podcast as well, co-host Application Security Podcast, where we talk a lot about threat modeling. I've presented quite a bit on threat modeling, and also have had opportunity to work with a number of organizations, helping them get threat modeling started, programs started, and trained a large number of people over the years and helping them with threat models and think about secure design.
Yeah, so safe to say you have a pretty extensive background in threat modeling, and I look forward to diving into some of the topics you touched on there. But before we get going, too deep, for folks not familiar with threat modeling, and maybe they've heard the term, or they don't really understand what it means. What is it exactly, and what is it not? Also, because I've seen it conflated with, threat hunting, for example, which is different. So what exactly is threat modeling?
Sure. Well, threat modeling is an activity or process where you're really trying to think about at its base level, think about what could go wrong, what could happen. And when I say think, it is a thinking tool. In fact, sometimes I will call it a critical thinking tool, where you can sometimes question assumptions about how something works. Have we thought about this happening, and so on? And so it's a mental model of potential threats against a system, as well as then determining, have we mitigated those threats? Are there some potential new mitigations that need to be put in place, countermeasures and so forth, to deal with those threats? And so then that becomes your threat model. A threat model essentially is an enumeration of threats that we've identified, as well as any mitigations or countermeasures against those threats. And that could then lead us into potential risk, determining, the likelihood of some of those threats happening, as well as ultimately lead into, which we want to do, secure design, more and better secure design.
Yeah, I know oh, go ahead.
Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I was going to say, I know when it comes to threat modeling, it's very popular, for example, to use something like Stride. Do you want to touch on, Stride or maybe other alternatives that tend to be used very often?
Sure. Well, Stride is a mnemonic that helps us to identify threats. And so it's just each letter stands for a type of threat. So, for example, spoofing, tampering, and so on. But Stride is just a way of helping you identify threats. It's not threat modeling. It's just a method, a tool that you can use to help you build a threat model to identify threats. But there are many, many other ways that you can use to identify threats. The simplest thing, we have this 4-question framework that we've talked about before, or has been talked about quite a bit. Is what are you working on? What could go wrong? And that second question, what could go wrong, is really at the heart of threat modeling, where you're trying to identify those threats. And again, Stride is just one of those ways that you can, or method you can use to try to help you identify threats.
Yeah, speaking of the 4 questions, I know you've been involved in a Threat Modeling Manifesto, and a project you've been involved with, and those 4 questions are featured right at the beginning of the document, as I saw it. Any thoughts or not thoughts, but, do you want to share any insights to like what led to that project and like how people can leverage it, what the value of it is, that kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. So the Threat Modeling Manifesto is a document that was created in the summer of 2020. So myself and 14 other uh, industry experts in threat modeling. There's folks from all around the world. There were authors, there are presenters, and those who are focused on privacy and security, all gathered together over that summer of 2020, all remote because that was around, of course, the pandemic and COVID and so forth. But we gathered once a week to talk about threat modeling. We had numerous emails back and forth. And through that process, we came up with this document. Our guiding idea was really to think about something similar to the Agile Manifesto that came out over 20 years ago, which talked about, what are our basic values? What are our basic principles that we want to think about in terms of applying Agile process to the work that we're doing in software? And so, in a similar way, the Threat Modeling Manifesto, sort of that same vein of thinking about, what is it, the most important thing about threat modeling? And if you notice, we don't talk about stride, we don't talk about certain methodologies. We wanted to get down to the very basic aspects of threat modeling. In fact, there's a definition that we came up with. Threat modeling is analyzing representations of a system to highlight concerns about security and privacy characteristics. So a very, very simple definition that describes the fact that we're analyzing, we're trying to think about security, we're trying to think about privacy and bring those out. And the 4-question framework, originally developed by Adam Shostak, who was also one of the authors of the manifesto, we incorporated it into the manifesto to say, at the highest level, that's what it's about, asking those 4 questions. And I already mentioned 2 of them. The other one is, what are we going to do about it? Number 3. And 4, did we do a good enough job? Do we need to go back and review, and so on? And so just applying those 4 can get you started. And that was the key of the manifesto, is to help teams, organizations get started and not be too much yet into is it stride, is it this tool, is it that tool, and so on. Just get started.
Yeah, I love that high level, kind of thought process, thought exercise to get people thinking about what could go wrong and how could we, remediate or mitigate the risk of, those things occurring. I think it would benefit a lot of people to implement that earlier in the software development lifecycle, for example. We also saw, like, you and I are both in the public sector to an extent. So, we saw the cybersecurity executive order where NIST came out subsequently and identified critical software, and they, provided recommendations of how to secure critical software. And threat modeling was right at the top of the list of that. That's pretty awesome for someone who's been, around threat modeling for as long as you have, for one, I would say. But also, like, I'm curious, like, your thoughts around them doing that and maybe the potential impact on the threat modeling community. Do you think we'll see, threat modeling as an activity, as a practice, grow, more interest in it? Anything along that line?
Oh, absolutely. When I saw that, I saw those inclusion of threat modeling in those papers last year. That was the first thing I thought about is, hey, wow, we've arrived, if you will, I think, finally, that we're recognizing the importance of threat modeling and being at the top there in terms of systems that we're working with. Do you have a threat model? Have you gone through this process before? I think speaks to how critical it is that we incorporate threat modeling into what we're doing and recognize that it needs to be a part of our all the activities that we're doing. They're all important, but threat modeling is also a very critical activity that we should be engaging in. So to see that, I think was first of all absolutely impressive and welcome change, but also I think for overall it's going to continue to increase, and I'm seeing it even here in 2022. More and more companies, organizations who are saying, hey, we've heard about this threat modeling. What is it? How do we maybe get started, and so forth? So I think that overall it will just continue to increase, which is very encouraging.
Yeah, I definitely think it'll be a boon to the the practice and utilization of threat modeling. I do want to ask, though, before I move to my next question, like, why did it take us so long to get here? In the sense that we've been building applications and using applications to power modern businesses for quite some time. How hasn't it taken us so long to get to the point where we ask these basic questions, like what could go wrong? how are we prepared to respond to it? Like, any thoughts around like why, that has taken us so long as an industry to get to, and why it's something we haven't done sooner?
Well, so it's to me, it's sort of a two-prong answer. One is that I like to say that we've already been doing threat modeling for a long time. We just didn't realize it. We do that all the time in our personal lives. For example, when we go and walk across the street, what do? Our threat model is that a car may hit us. And so we look around, right? We stop and look. We've heard that since very early on. That's what you do, but that's your mitigation. Your threat is the car coming. So we've already been doing that kind of thing. And even in software, we try to think about, how does the user use this particular feature, and so on. In terms of applying security, one of the reasons why we haven't seen it as much is because in terms of security, the focus has been primarily on the peripheral. Make sure I've got a firewall in place, make sure that I've got certain ports locked down, but not as much attention to the application itself and the security decisions that you're making. And so in those cases, the threat model was, as long as my peripheral, as long as my network is up and running and my firewall is up and running, I'm okay. So that was your threat model. But I think what has happened and why it's taken some time is that we started to see a result of the fact that our applications were not protected. We've seen data breaches. We've seen situations where a great amount of data has been pulled into other places and publicly revealed and so on. And, it may be credit cards, which sure, we can go get another credit card, but when it becomes personal information, social security numbers and so on, those kinds of things are much, much more difficult you can't change them, right? They're out there, and now what do I do? And so I think as a result of that, that's where we started focusing more and more on application security. Now, it's been around for a long time. People have been talking about it, but I think it's become much more, has gained much more attention over the last 10, 15 years as a result of the fact that we haven't done and given as much attention as we should have. And so that's where I think, that, and now we're starting to say, hey, it is the application. We need to think about it, the design. We need to focus more on it. We need to get better at this. And so I think that's sort of why we haven't seen it and why we are now.
Yeah, it's funny. A couple of things you said that really jumped out to me. You talked about in our personal lives. I'm not sure if you've ever read like Left of Bang, for example. It's about situational awareness. It's kind of draws from the military. But like, I think for me personally, when I go places, being cognizant of my surroundings and things that could occur, threats that could materialize, and just having situational awareness is like a good example of, a real world example, of threat modeling almost in a mental exercise. And then another thing you touched on, I think, really emphasizes where the industry is going, moving away, from the traditional like castle and moat, perimeter type defense, moving towards zero trust, where you talked about, we initially just used the network perimeter, for example, as like, we're good, we have this. Now it's starting to mature. We're starting to think about applications and higher up the stack, for example, threats that can materialize. So I think that was really great insight too. Another question I had for you as well is, or not question, but I wanted to point out, like, you talked about the NIST and the executive order, for example. We also saw OWASP, to your top 10 threat list, list insecure design high up on that list. Any thoughts on that being added in the sense of, how can threat modeling help mitigate insecure design?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, yes, the OWASP top 10 has been around for almost 20 years, over 20 years, rather. Another list that many organizations use is just really as a starting place to think about application security. And yeah, this past year, number 4, insecure design appeared, which was fantastic to see. And so what's the threat of insecure design? Well, if I don't have a good secure design, I don't have a good foundation for my application to build on. And threat modeling as being the answer to that, to help you think through those threats, to help then guide your secure design. And so I think seeing that in that document and all the other documents, we're starting to see where threat modeling is becoming a very critical part of all the other things we need to think about. I think, again, it's a great step in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Another question I had is like we talked about maturing towards zero trust. Obviously there's cloud adoption. We're moving towards DevSecOps in many organizations. I have heard some voices, even prominent voices, say that threat modeling is too cumbersome of an activity, in the modern DevSecOps paradigm. Any thoughts on that? And I know I've also heard some other, great folks like Adam Shostak and Alyssa Miller and such, talk about threat modeling in agile and DevSecOps environments. So I'm curious your perspective there.
Yeah. So, well, there's a couple things. I'll quote my friend Brooke Schoenfeld, who likes to say that even DevOps, most people say, well, it's too fast, so therefore we can't think. And as Brooke would say, of course you are. You're always thinking, and that's the reality. We're always thinking, we're always designing, we're always developing, and so even though the biggest argument against is that, well, it takes time and we don't have time to take time. We've got to move fast. We're delivering many times a day, and so on. And so, what I would say is that, and what I've seen is that you have a couple of approaches. One is that there's the threat model, a baseline that just gives you a good idea of where you are, and then there's the incremental threat modeling, and then you can break that down into as discrete as element as you need. It could be within your user story where you can apply some of these questions. What could go wrong here in this user story? Would somebody maybe want to try to compromise the way we're putting this user story together? And so you can get to a small discrete item there and apply the same principles of a threat model. And that doesn't take very long at all, just to ask those questions. And so that's how I see in terms of continuing this idea of thinking about secure design, thinking about your threats, even as you go along. And there's also another concept, continuous threat modeling. Izar Turndok also talks about that, has introduced that idea of your baseline threat model. And then as you approach a story, ask the question, is there a security issue here that we need to think about? Or does this impact our security? No, move on. Yes, then take a moment, ask those questions. And so then you're continuing to apply threat modeling in your user stories, in all the work that you're doing all the time. And it's a good way of just keeping that mindset and applying it as you go along. And so in that way, it naturally falls into all the other things that you're doing within that very quick pace activity of development today in DevOps and DevSecOps.
Yeah, I like that. I like where you're going with that in terms of aligning with like the agile and DevSecOps methodologies and kind of integrating threat modeling into that activity. And I'm actually not also a fan of the we're too busy, we don't have time argument. That's kind of pushing security to the side and saying we don't have time for security. Like as an industry, we've seen many data breaches and exposures and insecure applications and code delivered to production. It reminds me of like the meme where the cavemen are carrying stones and like there's a car next to them, like a wheel, and like, oh, we don't have time, we're too busy. Well, I think we might need to take some time and get our house in order, because we're continuing the path we're on now is not looking well. So I had another question for you, when it comes to threat modeling and as we move towards, cloud and things like that, when you look at cloud and managed service providers, cloud service providers, that kind of construct, does threat modeling change in that, kind of a construct versus like an on-prem infrastructure where you have like, shared services, managed services involved, third parties involved, thoughts around that when it comes to threat modeling?
Sure. A lot of the principles still apply. So, for example, one approach is to think about the various systems that you're working with and how they're interacting and so on. And so you can still do that within a cloud environment. But in this case, there are some differences, of course, because maybe you're also thinking about the environment that you're working in, which cloud vendor are you using, and the services they provide. And you may be reviewing the different ways of putting them together. If it's a SaaS product, if it's PaaS or infrastructure and so on, you can think about those things and how does that impact the security of the system. You can think about key management can be a little bit different, certainly different in a cloud environment. How are you authenticating and authorizing and so forth? How are those things different? So There are certainly some very specific things that are different in a cloud environment, but the basics of applying some of these principles are very similar. So you just have to be aware of your environment, and that's true of any threat model. How much do I know? What do I not know? Um, what kinds of questions do I ask, and so forth, that will apply to this environment so that I can really think about the best secure design as possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think as we see the push, for software supply chain security and more broadly, supply chain risk management, it would behoove organizations to take the time to think about, how can these third-party entities that I'm consuming software from or services from, et cetera, like how can they impact me? What can go wrong? And how does that, impact my business continuity or disaster recovery? Like all those kind of things, I think would be a great exercise for organizations to do. So you talked about how organizations are taking more interest in threat modeling, for example, and looking to start threat modeling programs. For organizations that don't have a program like this in place, how do you recommend they get started? Where do they start from? What are some good resources? Any recommendations there?
Yeah, sure. So, a few things. Hopefully, somebody has bought into it. Ideally, leadership and management have understood, what it is. But if not, you want certainly somebody who has gained an understanding of it, and then just start where they are. And so they might, for example, work with their team or several teams and just start, hey, let's just take a moment. You were working through a user story. Let's just ask the questions. What could go wrong here? And so you can start very, very simply that way. The other thing I would also say, another key thing that I haven't mentioned yet, but I definitely wanted to point out is that a good threat model, certainly one person can work on it, but I always advocate a team working on it. So gathering various people from different perspectives, and we also talk about that in the Threat Modeling Manifesto. Get a diverse team that has expertise in different areas, because that helps with creativity, that helps with brainstorming. You may have an area that you know really well, but somebody else doesn't, and vice versa. And so all of you can bring something to the table. So that can really help you. So just getting started and working with a few teams. And then from there, think about how do we then learn about this? And so you can look at some training. I know there's quite a bit of training out there on videos and so forth that are available today. There are a number of books that are out there. A couple I'll recommend just off the bat is Threat Modeling, A Practical Guide for Development Teams by Azar Tarandock and Matthew Coles. That's today my go-to to start with, just to start with. Very, very easy, quick read. You can set up, if you want to read that with your teams, you can do that. Another one, of course, Threat Modeling by Adam Shostak, and I know he has a new book that's coming out very soon. And those couple books right there, just to get started, if your team likes to read and wants to look at some stuff. But again, there's some videos, there's some other things that they can take a look at to get some training. And then from there, start to work on, okay, how do we then go from here to not just getting started, but also building as a part of the work that we do. And as I mentioned, there are some approaches like the continuous threat modeling and so on that you can apply to say, let's think about a threat model early on if we can. Now, there are some organizations that will put threat modeling towards the end. I don't always agree with that, but there are some organizations that will start there and work their way back towards the front as well. But I'd say just get started, start small and build from there.
Yeah, it sounds like there's no shortage of resources and things for people to pull from, to learn and get going. So I like the recommendations there. And I also like the aspect of, you mentioned, the different perspectives, because, maybe someone that's not in cyber like us, an end user or a human-centered design developer, et cetera, they may see things from different perspective and think of things that we didn't even think of. And ultimately, like all those perspectives and different, backgrounds and thoughts, can lead to a more resilient system, I think. So I like where you're going with that. One thing I wanted to ask is, say you have an environment that has many systems already up and operational. They haven't had a chance to start with threat modeling earlier in the SDLC, for example. How do you get people, and have you seen this too? Like how do you get people comfortable with doing threat modeling and not being concerned that it may, uncover some insecure design or, vulnerabilities in the system and not looking at it as a punitive activity, kind of viewing it in a positive light? Any thoughts on that?
Sure. One way is, especially if you have an organization where there are a lot of things, a lot of projects, a lot of systems that are already in place. You could also focus on just the new features for the time being. And okay, we've got a new feature. Now let's spend a little bit of time. And so that's a good place where we're still at the beginning. We still don't know exactly how we're going to put this together. We have an idea, but we need to think about it and work on it. And so that's a good way to introduce it, so that it sort of reduce the friction, if you will, because certainly many don't want to go back and look at everything. And in a practical way, you can't. But you can start there. And then what I also find is that in my experience, the more that I've taught developers and worked with developers, and they get that fun of brainstorming and seeing how this can really help them, not only in just that small feature, but they may go back and review some other things that they're doing, and even other future work and so forth. And so sometimes I find that threat modeling, you can teach it, but it's also one of those things that's caught. And so you're modeling that yourself, the work that you're doing. They see it, they get engaged in it, and they start to apply it as well. And so again, it doesn't have to be, 5-week threat model exercise. It can be just a couple of minutes and say, let's just introduce it here, and it's at a good time, a new feature, a new story, and that could be a good way to help see it and then start to incorporate it into future work as well.
Yeah, I like where you're going with that. Make it fun and make it engaging so people enjoy participating in it, and it becomes, kind of a fun exercise to participate in. One question I wanted to ask you, you talked about working with developers. I could see some perspectives where they would say like, well, we can't really scale this. Robert can only be in so many places at a time kind of thing. We have, 50 development teams. Any thoughts around how organizations can successfully scale threat modeling and kind of, create maybe some security or threat modeling champions across the organization?
Sure, and that's really it, is champions. I've built a program before where I incorporated volunteers who, first of all, they went through some training. They were really interested in it. We gave them an opportunity. Would you like to help us in sort of promoting this and working with teams? And they said yes. And so we trained them and helped them out and guide them along. And we would work with a team. And so myself, our colleague, and others on our team would walk with them until they got that confidence to say, okay, I think I can do this myself. And so what you're doing is you're building out, sometimes we'll call it application security champions or security champions, where you're building out a team of people who can promote the activities. And it may not just be threat modeling, it may be working with tools and so on, but threat modeling certainly could be one very key part of that. And many times what I find really helpful is if you can find folks who are maybe already on those teams that have an interest in security. So it could be a developer, but it doesn't always have to be. In fact, quite a few folks that I would bring into our volunteer team didn't have a background in security at first, didn't have a background in development, but they had a great interest. They brought what they already knew. Maybe they were focused on data, maybe they're focused on project management and so forth. And they applied those skills along with the threat modeling, and were very effective. And so, it's a great opportunity, a great way to scale is by building those champion programs so that, and of course you need to cultivate it. Threat modeling is, we sometimes will talk and focus more on the technical aspects, but in my mind, it's really an interpersonal thing, because you are working with teams, especially if you're working together as a team. And so it's about people, and so you need to cultivate that champion team and provide guidance, provide training, encourage them, and so on. And so that's an important part of that as well, but that's how you scale. One definitely good way to scale out threat modeling.
Yeah, it seems like a really logical and smart way to approach it, and help create evangelists across the organization who are familiar with it, and encourage it for others to participate. And also, I think, like as you touched on, it's like a great way to introduce people to security, in a sense that, like, without diving into like a technical topic right away, everyone's so focused on like what the system needs to do or how it should work. Maybe take some time thinking about like what could go wrong and how would we respond if it could go wrong, and what kind of malicious activities are people doing. Could be a great way to expose people to security concepts too, that don't have a security background. So last question I have for you before I let you go here. I know it's hard to predict the future, but we've seen, like you said, an introduction of threat modeling by, OWASP top 10. We've seen it, NIST and the Cybersecurity Executive Order kind of lead that charge there. Looking forward, maybe say 5 years, what does the future of threat modeling look like? When you look ahead, where do you see the industry going?
Well, a lot of people, it seems, they're very focused on the tooling, and that's certainly a part of it. Don't get me wrong; it is absolutely there, but I think also ways of incorporating the threat modeling into what we're already doing. And so there's some work that I've seen, threat modeling in code or as code or with code. And so, for example, Threat Agile is one that's working with YAML and trying to build into the CI/CD pipeline. There are some tools out there that will also try to build in some ways in the CI/CD pipeline. And so I think as we move ahead, I think that threat modeling will continue to try to be incorporated into other things that we're already doing in our development cycles. Whether it's the DevSecOps, how can we incorporate it there, and so on. And so that's where I see it going in the next 5 years, is just improving the tools, not for the tool's sake, but to help us then do what we're trying to do with threat modeling and building more secure systems and thinking about secure design. Another thing I've seen actually this past year is one thing I didn't mention is there are some card games, really fun card games that you can use to help you identify threats by looking at a diagram and applying a card with a scenario. There's Elevation of Privilege from Adam Shostak. OWASP Cornucopia is another card game. And the last year, if you think about it, well, we can't gather together anymore and play cards in person. And so they've actually put those together in a virtual way. And so you can play these card games in a virtual way. It's very cool. And so those kinds of things I see, again, being very creative in the situations that we're in today where we're not together all the time, and figuring out how can we incorporate some of these ideas and principles that meets people where they are.
Yeah, I like where it's headed with the games as well, because you talked about the social aspect, the interaction, interpersonal skills. Like, I think it makes it fun and engaging and something people that want to participate in with their peers, and be a really cool exercise to be involved in. So that said, we're at the end of our time. I wanted to ask, for folks that aren't following you already, where can they find you? Where can they follow your podcasts or your talks? Get a little plug for that real quick.
Yeah, sure. So I'm on Twitter, Robert Hurlbut. Just look me up, full name there. I have a website. It's not been updated in a while, but it's roberthurlbut.com. I plan to do some updates to it here soon. And then the podcast, if you just look up Application Security Podcast, and that'll take you over to Security Journey, where that's hosted with my co-host, Chris Romeo. And then, of course, on LinkedIn. If you find me on LinkedIn, just simply reach out with a message. Let me know, hey, I watched this podcast and like to connect or talk, and happy to connect.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming and sharing all the threat modeling knowledge with us, and I hope you have a good day. Thank you, everyone.
Too. Thanks.